There's a strange assumption people make when they hear the word atheism. They think it's just another belief system, a counter-religion, a worldview that takes faith in its own way, and that assumption couldn't be more wrong. Atheism isn't a belief, it's the absence of one. That's it. No rituals, no sacred texts, no invisible promises hanging over our heads. Just the decision, or more accurately, the default state, of not accepting a claim without evidence. That's where things get interesting, because this simple lack of belief terrifies organized religions more than anything else. Why? Because religion survives on one basic rule. Belief is the default, and disbelief is a rebellion. If that rule collapses, so does its power. The idea that people can simply opt out, not by switching faiths, not by joining a rival creed, but by rejecting the entire framework, undermines the very ground religions stand on. See, belief systems operate like a closed economy. They trade in meaning, identity, and fear of the unknown. But the moment someone says, "I don't need this currency," the system starts to lose its value. And if enough people stop playing, the whole market crashes. That's why atheism, as non-belief, is such a radical force. Not because it attacks religion, but because it ignores it. Like a store that shuts down because customers just stopped showing up. No protest, no war, just indifference. Now, here's what's fascinating. People often say, well, isn't not believing still a belief? You believe there's no God. That sounds clever until you really look at it. It's like saying not collecting stamps is a hobby, or that baldness is a hairstyle. The absence of something isn't the same as its opposite. If someone claims unicorns exist, and you say, "I'm not convinced," you're not in a unicorn denial cult. You're just unconvinced. That's what atheism is, nothing more mystical than that. And yet, religions work very hard to blur that line. Why? Because if non-belief is seen as neutral, religion loses the high ground. It goes from being the center of reality to just another claim people can reject. And when that happens, the entire structure of moral authority begins to wobble. Religious institutions don't fear rival doctrines nearly as much as they fear indifference. A competing religion at least plays by the same rules. It still says, there's something beyond reason you must accept, but non-belief says, what if you don't need any of that? That's not a debate. That's an existential threat. And you can see the ripple effects everywhere. Why do so many religious leaders insist atheism leads to moral chaos? Why do they frame it as dangerous, destructive, even demonic? It's because deep down they know something simple. If morality can exist without gods, then gods lose their monopoly. And when that monopoly breaks, control slips away. Pause for a second and think about that fear. If your entire worldview depends on the idea that humans can't be good without divine oversight, what happens when billions of people start proving the opposite? That's not just a theological problem. That's a business problem. And make no mistake, religion has always been a business as much as a belief. Look at history. The church wasn't just a spiritual guide, it was a political powerhouse. It owned land, collected taxes, crowned kings. Its survival depended on convincing people that rejecting faith wasn't an option. Because the moment people realized belief was voluntary, and worse, unnecessary, the power pyramid cracked. And now in the modern world, that crack is turning into a fault line. More people than ever are stepping away, quietly, without drama, not because they've discovered some new religion, but because they've stopped needing one. And that shift scares the system in ways sermons will never admit. So why does the idea of non-belief feel so threatening to people who live inside a belief system? It comes down to something very basic in human psychology. Certainty feels safe. We're wired to look for patterns, for meaning, for something that says, here's why you're here and here's what happens next. Religion offers that in bulk, packaged, polished, and handed down with authority. Now imagine a worldview that doesn't give you that safety net. No cosmic plan, no invisible parent watching over you, no guaranteed life after death. Just the raw, unfiltered reality that life might be finite and meaning isn't pre-installed. That sounds terrifying at first, and religions know that fear is their strongest weapon. If you tell someone the universe doesn't owe you a purpose, it can feel like a punch in the gut. But is that actually bad? Or is it liberating? Because if meaning isn't handed down from above, that means we get to create it. We're the authors. And that flips the script entirely. The problem for religions is that fear sells better than freedom. If people realize they don't need a sacred rule book to live a moral, fulfilling life, why would they keep paying the subscription? Why would they tithe? Why would they obey authority figures who claim divine privilege? That's not just a theological loss, that's a collapse of influence, wealth, and control. This is why the narrative is so carefully managed. Atheism isn't portrayed as a neutral position, it's branded as cold, empty, and even dangerous. You've heard the slogans, "Without God, everything is permitted." If you don't believe life has no meaning, these aren't arguments, they're scare tactics. Because the truth is, moral behavior existed long before organized religion. Archaeology shows that cooperation and empathy were part of human societies tens of thousands of years before anyone carved commandments into stone. Morality is older than God's, and that's a fact religions can't afford to highlight. Because if compassion and justice are natural outcomes of being social animals, then the entire sales pitch, that divine authority is the only thing keeping us from chaos, falls apart. Here's something interesting most people never hear about. Studies in moral psychology consistently show that secular societies tend to score higher on measures like equality, human rights, and overall happiness. Countries with the lowest levels of religious belief often have the highest levels of education, healthcare, and social trust. Does that mean religion makes societies worse? Not necessarily, but it does explode the myth that belief is the foundation of ethics. It's not. If anything, it shows that when people rely on human reasoning instead of divine command, they often build fairer systems. And this is where the fear deepens, because once you admit that morality, meaning, and community can thrive without gods, what exactly is left for religion to claim as its exclusive territory? Eternal life? That's the last card on the table, and that's why you'll notice most faiths put such heavy emphasis on death. What happens after? Who gets rewarded? Who gets punished? They've turned the unknown into a leverage point. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Promises about the afterlife have zero evidence, and deep down, religions know it. Which is why doubt is treated like a contagion, why questioning gets demonized, why believers are taught that non-believers are dangerous, corrupt, even evil. Because if people start asking for proof and none shows up, the whole system loses its grip. Notice something. When someone says, "I don't believe in your God," that's not an attack, it's a personal position. But religions don't respond like that. They act as if disbelief is an assault. Why? Because it breaks the illusion of universality. Faith thrives on the sense that everyone believes, or at least everyone should believe. The moment people see others living well without it, the spell weakens. There's another layer to why disbelief scares religions, and it's not just about theology, it's about identity. For a lot of people, religion isn't just something they believe, it's who they are. It's stitched into family culture tradition. It's a social passport. So when someone steps outside of that, it's not seen as you changed your mind about a claim. It feels like betrayal. It feels personal. Because the system is designed to make belief equal belonging. Think about how this plays out. When a person says, "I no longer believe," they often lose more than faith. They risk losing family ties, friendships, sometimes their entire community. Why? Because religion isn't content to be a private choice. It wraps itself around the core of social life, so leaving it feels like tearing out part of your identity. And religions do that deliberately. They create what sociologists call high-cost groups. The higher the cost of leaving, the more likely people are to stay. It is why so many faiths frame doubt as sin, not because doubt is inherently bad, but because doubt is contagious. If one person walks away and still lives a good life, others start to notice, and that noticing is dangerous. It creates cracks in the collective illusion, and when enough cracks appear, the whole wall starts to crumble. You see this fear expressed in subtle ways too. Ever noticed how often religious leaders talk about protecting the youth from atheism, or how non-belief gets tied to moral decay in sermons and speeches? That's not random. That's narrative control. It's a strategy to keep people inside by painting the outside world as bleak and broken, even when all the evidence says otherwise. And here's the irony. The most moral argument religions have against non-belief is fear. Not evidence, not reason, fear. Fear of eternal punishment, fear of meaninglessness, fear of chaos. But fear isn't truth. It's a tool. And once you see that, the tool stops working. But let's go deeper. Why do so many people assume life without belief must feel empty? Part of it comes from how deeply we've been conditioned to see purpose as something that must come from outside ourselves, from something bigger, something eternal. Religion promises that your life isn't random, that every event has meaning, that suffering has a reason. And honestly, that story is comforting, which is why giving it up feels like losing gravity, like floating in a void. But here's what's overlooked. That void is actually freedom. It's not that life has no meaning. It's that meaning is no longer pre-written. We get to write it. And that's terrifying if you've spent your whole life reading from someone else's script. But once you adapt to that freedom, it's empowering. It's the difference between being a character in someone else's novel and being the author of your own. Now ask yourself, why would religions want people to believe they can't handle that freedom? Why would they insist that without divine guidance, humans collapse into chaos? It's because control depends on dependence. If you believe you need the system to be moral, to find purpose, to feel safe, you'll never leave. And that's the point. Even language is stacked against non-belief. Think about the word atheist. It's defined by what it isn't, like a label that says defective believer. It frames non-belief as the exception, not the default, and that's no accident. For most of human history, religions control the narrative. They set the terms. So even now, when you say you don't believe, it sounds like you've stepped outside the norm, but the truth is, the norm is shifting fast. In fact, surveys show that in many countries, especially among younger generations, non-belief isn't the fringe anymore. It's becoming the baseline. And that scares the guardians of faith more than anything. Because if godlessness isn't rare, it isn't wrong. It's just ordinary. And when that happens, the fear-based grip weakens drastically. When a system feels its grip loosening, it doesn't just collapse quietly, it adapts. And religions have been doing that for centuries. When science began erasing old dogmas, faith didn't vanish, it reinvented itself. When people stopped taking hellfire literally, preachers started talking about spiritual fulfillment instead. The marketing changes, but the product is the same. Dependent. You can see this happening right now. In regions where strict doctrine is losing appeal, religions pivot to softer branding. It's not about rules, it's about relationship. They frame faith as a lifestyle, not an obligation. Why? Because they know fear alone doesn't work like it used to. People have options now. And nothing is more dangerous to control than options. But here's something subtle. Even as religions modernize, they almost always keep one strategy in place, framing non-belief as a belief. You've probably heard it, atheism is just another faith. You believe in science like we believe in God. That sounds clever, but it's smoke and mirrors. The goal is to drag non-belief back into the same category as religion, so it looks like a fair fight, because if non-belief is truly neutral, if it's simply the absence of a claim, then religion stops being the default. It becomes just one claim among many, and that is the nightmare scenario for any dominant system. This tactic works because humans love symmetry. If I have a belief and you disagree, it feels like you must have a belief too. But reality doesn't work that way. If I say there's an invisible dragon in my garage and you say, I don't think so, you don't need a counter-dragon theory. You're not in the no-dragon religion, you just don't buy the claim. That's what non-belief is. No counter-doctrine, no sacred text of disbelief, no rituals of denial, just the lack of conviction in something that hasn't met the burden of proof. And that's what really frightens religions. Because if people start seeing non-belief for what it is, the default position until evidence appears, the illusion of faith as normal starts to collapse. And when the illusion collapses, authority crumbles right behind it. Let's look at some real-world examples. In countries where secularism has surged, religion often responds with moral panic. Politicians warn that society is in decline, families are falling apart, civilization is at risk. The irony? These warnings rarely match the data. In fact, some of the most secular nations on Earth, places like Sweden, Denmark, Japan, have some of the lowest crime rates, longest life expectancies, and highest levels of happiness. Meanwhile, some of the most religious societies struggle with violence, corruption, and inequality. Does that prove religion causes harm? No. But it absolutely destroys the claim that godlessness leads to chaos. And that's why fear campaigns keep getting louder, because the numbers tell a story organized faith doesn't want to hear. People can live well without it. They can build laws without scripture. They can form communities without temples. They can find awe and wonder without worship. Once that truth spreads, the old narratives lose power, and when power fades, the backlash begins. You see it in laws trying to privilege religion, in attempts to rewrite science curricula, in efforts to silence critics. These aren't random. They're defensive moves, survival strategies for a system watching its influence erode. Because deep down, religion knows something it can't admit. The greatest threat isn't another God. It's no God at all. Why? Because rival religions keep the game going. They argue about which doctrine is true, but they all agree on the rule that belief itself is necessary. Non-belief rejects the rule entirely. It steps off the board. And once people realize they can do that, the whole game starts looking optional. And that's the quiet revolution happening right now. Not through wars or crusades, but through indifference. People aren't storming churches, they're just walking past them. And for a system built on attention and obedience, nothing is more terrifying than being ignored. At the core of all this fear lies something deeper than theology. It's the fear of freedom. Because when you step away from belief, you're stepping into a world without guarantees. No cosmic safety net, no absolute answers, no ultimate judge waiting at the end. And that level of freedom can feel overwhelming. But here's the paradox. The very thing that feels scary at first is what makes life more authentic. Think about it. If meaning isn't handed down, you're free to create your own. If morality doesn't come from a rule book in the sky, you're responsible for shaping it with reason and empathy. That's a heavier burden than blind obedience, sure, but it's also real. It's yours. And that terrifies systems built on the promise that obedience is enough. Religions often frame this uncertainty as a flaw. as if the absence of fixed answers makes life empty. But uncertainty isn't emptiness, it's possibility. It's the space where creativity, growth, and discovery happen. If everything were predetermined, there'd be no real choice, no real progress. Uncertainty is the price we pay for being free and the reward we get for being alive. And this is where non-belief differs from any belief system. It doesn't promise you the universe cares about your choices. It doesn't offer eternal guarantees. It doesn't tell you a story to make the chaos feel tidy. What it offers, if we can even call it an offer, is honesty. An acknowledgement that we don't know everything. And that not knowing isn't a failure, it's reality. And reality, no matter how messy, is a better foundation than comforting illusion. This is why atheism or non-belief will never need evangelism. It doesn't need to spread through fear of hell or reward of heaven. It doesn't need holy books, creeds, or conversion rituals, because it's not a system you join. It's a position you arrive at when you stop accepting claims without evidence. That's it. No banners, no armies, no sacred wars, just a quiet shift in perspective. And that's exactly what makes it unstoppable, because you can fight a competing religion with doctrine and power. But how do you fight indifference? How do you fight people who simply stopped playing the game? Here's the uncomfortable truth for organized faith. Most people who leave aren't angry. They're not plotting the downfall of religion, they're just living their lives. And that's what makes this change so irreversible. You can't scare people back into a belief once they've realized they don't need it. Fear has an expiration date. Once it stops working, the story loses its grip. And maybe that's what progress looks like. Not loud revolutions, but quiet awakenings. Not burning cathedrals, but empty pews. Not because people have lost something, but because they've gained something. A sense that meaning, morality, and purpose were never locked in a holy book. They were inside us all along, waiting for us to take ownership. So the next time someone says atheism is just another belief, remember this. A belief demands acceptance without proof. Non-belief demands nothing. It simply refuses to fill gaps with fantasies. It trusts reality enough to leave the blanks where they are until evidence arrives. And that's not a weakness. That's intellectual honesty. Maybe that's why religions fear it so much. Because once you taste that honesty, once you realize you can live a full, meaningful life without cosmic permission, you can't unsee it. You can't go back. And that means the oldest power structure in human history is facing something it can't control. Not violence, not rebellion, just the quiet courage of people choosing reality over reassurance and walking away